had been crossed. The impact of the military ultimatum was not confined to diplomatic channels. Within minutes of the announcement, the shockwaves reached the global financial centers. Traders on the floor of the exchanges watched as the numbers shifted with unprecedented speed. The threat to energy installations was no longer a theoretical concern. It was an immediate, quantifiable risk to the global supply. Oil prices, which had been stable, began to fluctuate with a violent, erratic rhythm. Every tick upward reflected the growing fear that the flow of energy was about to be severed. Automated trading algorithms, programmed to react to geopolitical instability, triggered a cascade of sell orders and hedging maneuvers. The market was no longer pricing in a diplomatic dispute. It was pricing in the potential for a total blockade. Investors pulled back, seeking safety as the uncertainty intensified. The volatility was not just a reaction to the threat. It was a feedback loop. As prices surged, the economic pressure on nations dependent on the strait intensified, creating a sense of urgency that transcended the original standoff. The world's wallet was now directly exposed to the rhetoric emanating from the region. The market reaction served as a brutal, real-time indicator of the stakes involved. Beyond the immediate market panic, analysts began to map the long-term consequences of a potential blockade. They identified the Strait of Hormuz as a single point of failure in the global machine. If the flow of 20% of the world's oil were to stop, the impact would extend far beyond fuel prices. Every industrial sector, from manufacturing to food production, relies on the energy moving through that narrow artery. The experts described a domino effect where the initial supply shock would force factories to halt operations and logistics networks to collapse. Developing nations, lacking the reserves to weather a sustained shortage, would face immediate economic contraction. Developed nations would see their growth targets erased as the cost of energy rippled through every consumer good. The warning was clear. The crisis would spare no one. The global supply chain would be forced into a state of paralysis. The warnings from analysts were met with a decisive shift in military posture. The United States government moved beyond diplomatic rhetoric, initiating a rapid reinforcement of its naval presence in the region. Within hours of the latest threats, command centers authorized the deployment of additional carrier strike groups toward the strait. The movement was not subtle. Massive vessels cut through the water, their radar systems scanning the horizon for any sign of interference. This was a physical manifestation of the U.S. commitment to the region, signaling that the era of mere posturing had ended. The arrival of these warships changed the tactical landscape of the waterway. Where there had been only commercial tankers and local patrol craft, there were now heavy destroyers and cruisers, their weapon systems active and tracking. The presence of the fleet created a new, immediate barrier between the opposing sides. Every move made by regional forces was now monitored by the advanced sensors of the arriving naval assets. This deployment served as a hard, visible line in the water, intended to deter any attempt to close the passage. With the fleet in position, the focus shifted from movement to mandate. U.S. officials issued a formal statement, stripping away the ambiguity of the previous weeks. They defined the Strait of Hormuz not as a regional territory subject to local control, but as a global artery protected by international law. This assertion of freedom of navigation served as a direct challenge to the Iranian position. Tehran had long maintained that the waterway was a pillar of its national security, a zone where it held the right to restrict access. Washington countered this by declaring that the transit of energy and goods was a collective interest, one that no single nation had the authority to disrupt. The rhetoric was precise and uncompromising. U.S. representatives emphasized that the right of passage was non-negotiable, effectively drawing a legal boundary that mirrored the physical line established by the warships. This created an immediate, irreconcilable conflict of definitions. Iran viewed the presence of foreign vessels as an encroachment on its sovereign waters, while the United States framed its naval operations as the enforcement of a global mandate. The diplomatic space for compromise vanished. By framing the issue as a matter of international law, the United States signaled that any attempt to block the strait would be treated as an act of aggression. The legal arguments ended when the radio silence broke. Washington moved from declarations to the activation of combat protocols. Across the deck of the lead destroyer, the crew shifted